President Lee Jae Myung is in Belgium on this Wednesday, the first leg of his 10-day, four-nation tour of Europe. We have more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome. You're watching Press Perspective for this Wednesday, June 10th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. Today we touch upon President Lee Jae Myung's diplomatic mission in Europe and its broader economic implications. For more on this, I have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio. Steven, welcome back.
Nice to be here. Thanks.
I also have Professor Song Soo-young at Chung-Ang University joining our talk virtually. Professor Song, it's been a while. Great to have you back.
Good afternoon to you, and thank you for having me here.
Right, of course. Steven, let's start with some information about President Lee Jae Myung's agenda in Europe during his 10-day visit there. He's in Belgium as we speak.
Yeah, it looks like it's set to be a pretty busy trip. He's starting off in Belgium, which is where the headquarters of the European Union is. And while he's there, I believe he's set to meet with both with the Belgian Prime Minister and also with the head of the European Commission. And he'll have a number of things to discuss there. I think exports, defense exports and trade with the European Union will be pretty high on his agenda there. And then I think after that, he will go to Italy, where he will meet with the Italian Prime Minister. And then he will travel to the Vatican, where he will, I think, take part in a mass. And he will, whenever Korean officials engage with the Vatican, it seems like the topic of peace on the Korean peninsula comes up, how to best deal with North Korea, how to move away from confrontation. And then after that, he will travel to the city of Evian, which I think most of us know from seeing on water bottles over the years, to take part in the G7 summit. I mean, South Korea is not a G7 country, so I don't know exactly the technical term for South Korea's participation there, if it's like as an invited guest or as or something to that effect. And while there, I think the member countries are going to be discussing trade and other economic matters, how to cope with various international challenges such as the war in the Middle East. And of course, like every discussion nowadays, they're going to be talking a lot about AI. Artificial intelligence is coming into our lives in any number of ways, and I think they will discuss ways to harness AI and ways to regulate it. And Lee is at a kind of interesting part of his presidency. I covered his first year press conference on Monday, and there was a real tone of optimism there. I mean, the slogan of the press conference was translates roughly as like making South Korea an irreplaceable country. This being a unique place with a lot to offer in terms of technology and popular culture and all the rest. So I think Lee will be, this is an opportunity for Lee to kind of carry out that vision and take some steps towards realizing that premise of South Korea being irreplaceable.
All right, staying with that then, Professor Song, briefly speaking, what are the diplomatic and economic implications of the President's trip to Europe?
Actually, this is the first visit to European continent by President Lee Jae Myung since his assumption of the presidential office in last year, June 4th. So I believe this is a really good chance to develop some the ties, and particularly about the reason why this journey has chosen the first leg of visit is Brussels. I mean, the Belgium is because de facto Brussels is the capital city of the European Union. They have hosted European Council, European Parliamentary, and also European executive offices. Of course, most importantly, NATO headquarters is located here. So this is that's why it starts with Brussels in Belgium. Or in addition to that, in the G7 in Evian in France, G7 summit meeting will be held, and also there are some invited countries such as Kenya, and Syria and Brazil, India. So in addition to some advanced countries, these countries are also very important partners for the President Lee have a talk with and to expand our economic relationship and diplomatic influence over the world.
Right, of course, sideline summits along with the G7 gathering. Professor Song, some here in the country in the meantime have voiced hopes for this latest presidential trip to Europe to bolster K defense exports. What are your thoughts?
I believe most recently, in the May 31st, there was some ministry-level defense minister talk held in Singapore. There, the defense minister of the United States has criticized again the European Union countries, and also he demands the increase of the government spending for 3.5% of their own GDP. So when in contrast, some East Asian countries have spent enough defense budget. So to that regards, what is clear is the United States clearly urged the European unions to spend money for the defense and the collective security and the collective defense. So to that regards, the European unions would like to build up their defense instruments and the facilities, and also in the case of the withdrawal of the U.S. armed forces from Europe. But it is believed most unlikely to occur soon. But however, still the European Union clearly needs a defense build up. Therefore, South Korea could participate and utilize this opportunity to promote our industrial and economic relationship with European unions.
Right, and with regard to defense, the British daily, the Financial Times, Steven, says that South Korea is indeed reaping the benefits of the global rearmament race as well as that of AI. Could you tell us a bit about this coverage and your takeaways?
Yeah, it's an interesting piece, just kind of taking a snapshot of the Korean economy and highlighting that there are several areas of the Korean economy that are doing really well as a consequence of global movement. So the piece really highlights memory chips, which, as we all know, are really booming right now because of all of the construction of data centers and just a lot of the investments in artificial intelligence that's going on. There's also shipbuilding. South Korea and China are really like the major players in shipbuilding right now, and they're enjoying some really brisk business. South Korea's shipbuilding sector has stepped up its cooperation with the U.S., and there's like some promising projects on the horizon there. But the news in the South Korean economy is not all good. I mean, sometimes you hear this talk about like a K-shaped recovery or a K-shaped economy. So there's real boom times in certain sectors, but SMEs are still really struggling. Wages are stagnant in a lot of sectors. Housing prices are still beyond the reach of a lot of families. And so, while we see, kind of headline numbers when it comes to big companies like Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, both of whom I believe recently exceeded $1 trillion in market capitalization. And then also the piece goes on to highlight that South Korea is facing this ever-present threat of China, whereas as China develops its technological prowess in a lot of different areas, it is coming to narrow the gap with South Korean companies in almost every sector except semiconductors, and that in the near, it's already happening in some sectors, but the kind of scary scenario is that South Korean sectors are not really able to compete, and they get kind of priced out of business, which has already happened in a lot of, if you follow the industrial history of this country, South Korean manufacturers have already been put out of business because they can no longer compete with China on price, and that's happened already in a lot of places. And so there's a fear that this could have a broader effect than it already has. And so the Financial Times quote, there's one quote in it that I thought was really interesting, and it described South Korea's industry as living in a semi-permanent sense of paranoia, of this, always feeling like there are threats from abroad, and doomsday could come at any time. And in one sense, that's a kind of negative way to approach your business, but at the same time, it can be positive in the sense that it creates this constant sense of vigilance. It creates this constant awareness that you cannot become complacent in any kind of business. You need to keep moving forward. You need to keep innovating. You need to keep trying to do things better and more efficiently. I've said on these airways a number of times that one thing I admire about this country is that nobody really sits still, nobody rests on their laurels. People in all areas of life, in governments, in business, in education, and whatever it happens to be, realize that in order to maintain your comforts, in order to maintain your prosperity, it requires constant efforts and constant attention. And so the piece kind of ends on that optimistic note that wherever the economy goes, the people in charge in Korea will keep attempting to move forward and to keep things going in a positive direction.
All right, staying with that optimism, Professor Song, the South Korean stock market has been seeing quite remarkable rallies in recent times. What are your thoughts regarding the rally of the local bourse? Do you believe it's sustainable?
I believe that considering this Samsung Electronics and the SK Hynix, and clearly the demand for the AI and the chips and the DRAMs are in the phase of the super cycle. Therefore, they continue to survive and prosper until, according to the report, that until 2030. The reason is because there is a bottleneck, and each country has needed to build up some AI data center to keep their sovereignty in terms of AI issues. So the DRAM and some HBM high bandwidth memory is still in short supply. Therefore, to that regard, it is good. But as Stephen has well illustrated, there is some shade side. Bright side is good, but the shade, dark side is some stagnant wage growth for some small and medium enterprise. And clearly, the K-type recovery of the economy and development is not good for the whole robustness of the Korean economy. So, but however, still I have been quite optimistic about the sustainability of the Korean capital market because of the government's policy to relieve the burden of the individual investors and the other types of players in the economy could be make some proper expectation about what would be the future, even though some uncertainty from abroad is clearly an obstacle. But however, domestically, the current economic situation is fairly predictable. Therefore, the local Korean capital markets rally, not actually rally, does stay and the stabilization could be sustained.
Right, and staying with the local stock market, Stephen, the Wall Street Journal claims, and I quote, a 5% sell-off on the local bourse is no big deal. Could you give us some context?
Well, on the current Korean bourse, I would say, yeah, it's no big deal. The writer here just makes a point that the Kospi is up 94% this year, which is just a number that nobody saw coming. I mean, again, going back to Lee's press conference on Monday, I mean, he said that he thought getting the Kospi to 5,000 in his first year, I believe it was like a realistic goal. Well, now it's well over 8,000. So the idea is just that what's happening on the Kospi right now is that you have a high concentration in these two big chip makers, SK Hynix and Samsung Electronics, and a flood of individual investors, South Korean and foreigners. People who are kind of new to the Kospi, who see it as a rising wave that they want to get in on. But these kind of unusual circumstances create quite a bit of volatility. And so the writer plots out how there have been a number of times that the Kospi has fallen by 5%, but a larger number of times that it has risen more than 5%. I think he says that there's been nine times this year. And so this is a pattern that shows that every time you have a fall like this, there is a recovery that quite comfortably exceeds that fall. And I would say the other bit of context is just that the way markets work nowadays. I mean, it used to be that a 5% fall in a market, 20 or 30 years ago, that would have been front page news. That would have been, something that people took really seriously. But the way that markets move now, everything is just so much faster and everything is so much more drastic. Everything right now is being fueled by this technology that nobody really knows how sustainable is this going to be? How much is AI really going to change our daily lives? What kind of return are investors eventually going to see on artificial intelligence? Is this something that, a lot of money is being pumped into this technology and it will struggle to create the kind of returns that make this sustainable? If I had good answers to these questions, I wouldn't be sitting here now. I would be, on a yacht somewhere. I don't actually know how this is going to play out, but this is just a bit of a, kind of sober analysis that I think investors would find useful to not read too much into each little move on the Cosby.
Right. Professor Song, I wonder, British Daily, The Times points out that South Korea has created a nation of investors overnight. How do you respond to this observation? I mean, has there been a shift in the investment environment under the Lee Jae Myung administration? And so how has it affected the country's economy, do you think?
I think the expression of overnight does not fit with some genuine feature of the resilient and Korean economic situation right now, because clearly the Korean economy and Korean capital market has suffered so much from the Korea discount. Then, since the election of democratic government of the June 4th last year, and also the failed coup attempt by the preceding government, President Yoon, has clearly illustrated and demonstrated that the source of Korea discount is clearly the kind of politically calculated bellicosity under the guise of the red complex that had prevailed, so-called incumbent privileged elites and the Korean economy, elite class people. Therefore, this was removed, and also as long as we have a democratic and a liberal government has been chosen and selected, and together with some policy that was adopted and implemented by the President Lee, has such as some policy to allow these investors to garner the dividend income, and also there is some relief burden has been relieved from participating in the capital market. On the other hand, some biased ground has been corrected to help the individual and anti-investor to participate in. So altogether with these policy adoption and some well-chosen democratic government, and that has helped the Korean capital market has shown such a very high performance. So far, as long as this tendency continues, I believe that Korea capital market maintained some kind of very robust and reliable stance over the next several years.
Right then, Stephen, while the value of the local stock market has been rising in recent months, that of its currency has been falling, especially against the US dollar. What has been the analysis by the foreign media about this grave reality?
Well, all foreign media really can do right now is document this interesting scenario where you have policymakers making a number of efforts to try to stop the won slide, both verbal interventions, and they've announced, the finance ministry earlier this month announced some measures that are meant to curb speculation and meant to restore some kind of stability to the currency. But so far those have failed to, they've tempered the fall of the won somewhat, but they've not managed to engender a real turnaround. And I mean, I can just speculate here. I mean, I guess the big question is, do we see a currency as a reflection of the economic fundamentals of a country? And is the currency status like a reflection of how investors see the prospect of making money in that country? Well, as we've been discussing so far here today, South Korea is an economically pretty sound and stable place by most conventional measures, and you have a number of world-beating industries here and a fair bit of optimism, a fair bit of industries that are exceeding expectations, but at least so far that is not being reflected in what's happening with the currency. A bigger question, one that I don't know the answer to, is these chip makers and these booming exporters, how much of their earnings are they repatriating? Are they keeping this in foreign currencies, and is that having the effect of sapping some of the urgency out of the won? I don't really know. I wonder if maybe policymakers might sit down with corporate leaders and say, hey guys, we'd really appreciate it if you could bring some of these earnings back home and reinvest some of this here. Another thing is, this is still an export-oriented economy, so having a weak currency is not always the worst thing in the world. I mean, I know that Korean exporters have to import a lot of their energy, they have to import a lot of their raw materials, and having a weak currency presents a challenge there. But so far, especially since the beginning of the war in Iran, South Korea has been able to weather this quite admirably. I think the current scenario is a more optimistic picture than most pundits would have predicted. It'll just be a matter of time if we see that the overall strong measurements, if that can also shed some light on the currency, right, especially ahead of the summer vacation season.
Right,
a lot of people going abroad and
right.
want their money to go further.
Right. Professor Song, speaking very briefly, I believe we have about a minute or so. What are some of the variables that you choose to highlight amid the weakening won and the action in the local stock market?
Yeah, for the capital market, the most devastating damage is incurred by the war broke out, such as well illustrated in the U.S.-Iran war and the Russia-Ukraine war. So the war should be avoided in the Korean Peninsula and the East Asian terrain. And another issue is because in September, OpenAI and Anthropic will debut and make an IPO. That could cause some kind of volatility of the dollar outflow from Korean capital markets. So that could affect negatively against the Korean won's value. Of course, this was raised by Steven also, but this is a little bit risky. But however, I don't think it will. Those monies which are used to prepare for the purchase of some IPO stocks, and they will come back to Korean capital market again. Then the Korean won will be stabilized over time for the next several months.
All right. On that optimistic note, we shall end today's talk. Professor Song, as always, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
And Stephen here in the studio, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. We return same time tomorrow with updates on the President's diplomatic mission in Europe, as well as soaring exports of K-beauty products to rival the US and France. Do join us then. Thank you for now.